Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the session which will be looking at one of the biggest and most important developments in Latin America in the last decade, the arrival of China. As you've heard, my name is Isabel Hilton. I'm the founder and editor of a series of websites that look at China and its role in the world, including Diálogo Chino, which looks at China in Latin America. And we did this really because, the arrival of China in Latin America has had an extraordinary impact. China is now the largest trade partner of many of the countries in the region. Huge investments, huge infrastructure building. The arrival of a big new player at a time of geostrategic uncertainty raises many questions, creates many opportunities, and we're going to explore some of that. So just a few figures to begin with. Between 2000 and 2013, trade between China and Latin America increased by 22 times. And by 2017, it was worth 266 billion, which is halfway towards the target that was announced by Xi Jinping in the inaugural CELAC China summit in Beijing in 2015. That target was to reach US 500 million by 2025. Now, this is clearly good news. It sounds like good news, and it is good news. But there are some things to understand about that trade. It's not balanced. 5 products, soya, copper, refined copper, iron ore, and oil, accounted for 70% of those exports last year. It's also true that it's unevenly distributed geographically, and just a handful of countries, particularly with FDI, 80% of it is concentrated in mining and hydrocarbons, and a similar percentage in just 3 countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. So it's important, but it's not entirely balanced, and it's not entirely straightforward. However, so far, so impressive. The big beast in the landscape globally these days is the Belt and Road Initiative, which we're also going to be talking about. This is a slightly shape-shifting initiative from Xi Jinping. It remains relatively undefined, but Latin America is now formally included in the discussions of Belt and Road, so we'll be asking what that entails. And I'm absolutely delighted to have the honor of chairing this panel of distinguished contributors. We have a terrific lineup for this discussion. On my immediate left, Roger Valencia, who is the Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism in Peru. Roger's had more than 30 years of experience in the tourism sector, and after 2 years as Vice Minister, he became Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism in April this year. And just beyond Roger, we have from Panama, we have Dulcidio de la Guardia, who's the former Minister of Economy and Finance of Panama. He stepped down recently to go back to the private sector and has served as Finance Director of the Grupo Morgan & Morgan. He was Vice Minister of Finance of Panama and Director for Corporate and Market Banking at HSBC, in many other roles. To Dulcidio's left, we have Tatiana Rosito, who's the China Chief Representative and General Manager for Business Development in Asia for the Brazilian petro giant Petrobras. Before that, she is a career diplomat. She is an economist, and she served in the embassy, in the Brazilian embassy in Beijing. She has served as in the Brazilian delegation to the United Nations, and she's a member of the consultative board of the China-Brazil Business Council. And beyond Tatiana, we have Kevin Gallagher, who is a professor of global development policy at Boston University. Kevin has written many celebrated books which covering various aspects of China and Latin America relations, emerging markets, foreign direct investment, sustainability, and so on. He's one of the intellectual leaders in the analysis of the relationship with Latin America. And to his left, Álvaro Mendez from the London School of Economics, who is the co-founder of the LSE's Global South Unit, also a formidable academic in the field. He has a relationship with my old alma mater, Fudan University in Shanghai, although I think it's probably changed since I was a student there, and has much experience, again, in the field. So, onto our topic. I just wanted to begin by just reflecting briefly on this decade of China's increasing engagement in Latin America, and to ask each one of you, from your respective perspectives, what has been the impact of China's arrival in Latin America, a region where China had previously been a remarkably distant force and not a player. So,
okay.
What difference did it make?
What difference does it make? First of all, thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you, Kav, for having us here. Peru and China have a very long-term relationship. I don't know if everybody in the room is aware, but about 150 years ago, Chinese workers came to live in Peru. And in Peru, we have, Peruvian cuisine, which is today known in the world, has a strong influence of Chinese cuisine. And so that's a long time ago, 150 years. But even before that, already in the 17th century and early 18th century, Peru's copper, gold, and silver were going to China. And they were going to China through Manila. And Chinese products were coming from Manila to Mexico, part to Peru, part to Spain. The trade at that time was so important. Silk produced in China, brought by the galleon of Manila to Mexico, made the silk growers in Valencia, Spain, bankrupt in the early 18th century. By 1710, there was no more growers of producers of silk in Valencia. And so China has been part of the history. In recent years for Peru, China has invested a little over $10 billion in mining, in energy, in telecommunications, in construction projects, and it has created around 9,000 permanent jobs, which is an interesting part. And it did not come very easily. We were talking a minute ago about Shogun. Shogun Company was the first iron ore mining company that established itself in Peru almost 20 years ago. And we both learned from that establishment. It was in China, of course, being a much more vertical society, the role of unions and unions of workers is much less considered in the way you manage or in the way you govern your investment. And in Peru, unions play a bigger role. So unions acted up as they are used in Peru. And Shogun Company, they don't know how to handle it. They have learned, and both have benefited from the learning. So for Peru, today China is the largest trade partner. And yes, you're right that the biggest export of Peru is copper, still, after 500 years. But our products, especially agricultural niche products, specialized products, are growing at double digits with China. This year, about close to 18%.
Right. Dulcidio.
I will say that China has been a significant trade partner with many countries in Latin America for many years. In the particular case of Panama, China has been the second largest user of the Panama Canal and the largest supplier of the Panama, of the Colón-free zone. So Panama has been dealing with China in trade terms for many years. However, it was not until recently, last year, when Panama decided to establish a diplomatic relationship with China, and basically, and that has jump-started the relationship between both countries. We are in the process of developing a common bilateral agenda, which focus on trade, tourism, investments, and we accomplish that through very high political dialogue between the Panamanian authorities and the Chinese authorities. So the relationship is moving extremely well. I think we have accomplished many things in over a year, and we see a bright future for both Panama and China relationship in the next couple of years, in the next few years, sorry.
Tatiana, again, another country where China is the largest trade partner.
That's it. Thank you very much. First, thank you also for CAF and Inter-American Dialogue, and it's a privilege to be here also among this very distinguished set of speakers. Sticking to your question about what difference it has made right in this decade. I think I would go almost to the beginning, a decade now, the global financial crisis. China's role was, and with all the stimulus it gave to its economy, was fundamental also for the continuous growth in Brazil and in most part of Latin America and other emerging markets. That was a turning point. This was tremendously important for us to continue to have some policy space in Brazil. It's true that in hindsight we can say that it also created or aggravated some of the macroeconomic imbalances for China itself. And the country has been dealing with that more starkly since the adoption of the 13th multi-year plan. But so for Brazil and China, it has been a very, a crucial decade where China since 2009 is Brazil's largest destination market, is also our largest trade partner, both for exports and imports. I would also emphasize that during this time, the relation has, especially since after 2010 and in the last 2-3 years, we can say that the relationship went from basically a trade relationship to an investment relationship, which requires, I think, much more also maturity from both sides. During this time, Brazil and China have also agreed to start a global partnership, a strategic partnership. We had a strategic partnership since 1993, and in 2012, it was elevated to a global strategic partnership, meaning we also have, a dialogue in regional and global affairs. So overall, I would say that today we are in, I think Brazil and China relationship are at its highest point, I think historically, I would say, politically, but also economically, where we find most dynamism overall, and it will be interesting to talk later more about also our challenges and opportunities.
Kevin, you've watched this process very closely.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks to the CAF and to the dialogue, and to all of you for coming. Well, your question is what's it been like over the past decade?
What's been the impact? What's the difference?
A decade ago was the Lehman Brothers crisis, and if it wasn't for China, Latin America would be in really bad shape right now. There'd be many more situations like Venezuela and Argentina if it wasn't for China. It used to be that when the United States got a cold, Latin America got the flu. Well, the United States 10 years ago today had a really bad flu, but most countries in Latin America just had a mild cold, and China really helped them get out of it. As you mentioned, Isabel, they're now #1 trading partner for South America and #2 for the region as a whole, and now they're big investors in the region, and it's been a real boon to economic growth. China clearly has a plan for Latin America. It's one of the most strategic places on the planet for it. To be provocative, I'll say that Latin America doesn't necessarily have a strategic plan for China, and it's of utmost importance for Latin America to put that together, especially now, given the fact that the Trump administration and the United States, one of the traditional rudders of economic growth for Latin America and the Caribbean, is pulling back its economic engagement in the region and across the world through the renegotiation of NAFTA and the trade war that we are engaging the entire world with. If you think about China's, really sees the region as strategic. It sees it as a key place for natural resources, sees it as a key place for investment to help some of its companies go abroad. It really hasn't globalized its companies as much as other countries have. And it sees it as a place to invest. Not only have they reached $260 billion worth of trade already, but they've pledged, as you said, $500 billion in trade and $250 billion in investment. And already China's national development banks, according to a database that my institute puts together with the dialogue, invests more in long-run development in Latin America than Latin America's own development banks and the World Bank does almost every year on an annual basis. So this is, on many ways, this has been a big boon. It's ushered the best growth period in Latin America. If you look from 2003 till about 2016 or so, that's the best growth period that the region's experienced since the 1970s. And as Nora Lustig, who's going to be here tomorrow, has documented, many of the countries in the region took some of the premium and were able to erase some of the inequality and poverty that became so prevalent during the lost decades of the 80s and 90s. That said, it's accentuated the commodity-led growth in the region, which is the Achilles heel of long-run economic development in the region. And because of that kind of growth pattern, it's also endemic to social and environmental degradation, which has been on the uptick in the region throughout the period. And the Latin Americans really need to think about how to maximize those benefits. This is an incredible new growth pole for Latin America, but to mitigate those risks. And they really need to take the premiums from the new China relationship and invest it in industries and sectors of the future, invested in institutions to help mitigate those social and environmental risks, and work with the Chinese as a region, not just in bilateral negotiations, but work with a region to think about ways to unclog their arteries in terms of infrastructure and help the region trade with each other and trade with Asia in general. I think the CAF actually would be a great forum for that. CELAC is what China has sort of chosen to be the chief intermediary for the region, which is an interesting organization, but it lacks the deep capacity and the long history in the region and the trust in the region and the capabilities to be able to convene and to really co-finance and come up with a collaborative way to think about the future.
Right. Álvaro.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and I think everything has been said, but I'll say a few things as well. First of all, thank you to President Carranza for the invitation, Michael Shifter, Giampiero Leoncini, Patricio Scaff. Isabel, it's a pleasure to be here with you, my co-panelists as well, and the audience, some of you who are experts on China and Latin America yourselves. So what has been the difference? I suppose I'd like to start by saying that it has changed the dynamics of our region. I'm Colombian. Always looking up to the US. Colombians call this respice polum, I think, which is Latin for look to the north. The arrival of China to the region could be called respice sinis, meaning look towards China. It has helped Latin America as a whole to see beyond the Atlantic and to focus on the Pacific like never before. It has helped the region to think about Asia as a place that is not as far away as we thought. If you ever have the chance to buy a map in China, or to see a map from the Pacific perspective, you realize that Latin America is the window to Asia and vice versa, at least in the map. He has broken the monopoly of established multilateral development banks by introducing the idea of non-conditionality lending. I'm not so sure this is really the case. We'll debate this a little bit more later on. It has exposed our overly dependence on natural resources, which Kevin mentioned. It has also exposed our already existing vulnerabilities. We have weak foreign policy in general and a massive infrastructure deficit. We invest very little in research and development, and I think this is something that we knew all along, but I think it's more clear than ever, especially when we are just focusing on selling our commodities away. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
That's really interesting, and it strikes me that we are, for many reasons, at a very interesting moment in the world. Some of those reasons are pretty terrible, and we've talked about those in other fora. But Tatiana, you talked about. Several of you mentioned the global financial crisis and the fact that China's intervention at that point, or China's growth at that point, saved Latin America from much worse consequences there might have been of that crisis. China itself put in a massive rescue package into its own economy, a multi-trillion-dollar package, which is coming home to roost a bit in China. And we also heard in the opening session about the challenge of the end of the super cycle. So all of these things are beginning to come together as China itself is transitioning into another form of, or trying to transition into a new phase of its own economy, which will be less about sucking up natural resources, will be less about an infinitely growing demand for energy, coal, steel, all those things that have been the supplies that China has been most interested in around the world in the previous decades. Now, we've heard from several of you that Latin America has been the supplier of those goods, and that this is, good for GDP, but it's not necessarily good for development. And I'd like just to explore that and how that might change. Kevin, you brought this up. Just tell us why that's not good.
Well, as I said, it's really been the Achilles heel of the region. When commodities prices are up, the economies grow. Some countries use some of that premium and reinvest and get a little bit of a growth spurt, but there's been real difficulty in generating long-run growth. GDP per capita since 1980 in the region has been just a little over 1% per year. Largely because there hasn't been a diversity in trading partners and there hasn't been a diversity in the kinds of economic activity in the region. One of the great things about China is it brings diversity in trading partners. However, it's played a big role in sort of reconcentrating economic activity into those natural resource-based things. Now, China, I would disagree with you a little bit, even though China's economy is changing. Knock on wood, let's hope they don't have a financial crisis, because they did overshoot and do have their own massive debt problems. But we've calculated the consumption per capita of iron ore, copper, many of the core things, petroleum that the Chinese consume, and it's still at a much lower level than South Korea, Japan, and many other Asian countries. And so as China develops, there still will be a significant amount of demand for all of these great goods and services that Latin Americans have, which is an opportunity if they finally take the proceeds and invest in long-run research and development, innovation, people, and institutions, such that the environmental impacts aren't so harsh, and the benefits of that growth are more inclusive.
I agreeing in what you say, where you invest. I like to tell the story that many of you know is Peru. In the last 20 years, Peru decided that it could not be an autarkic economy, a closed economy, decided to open its markets, signed 19 free trade agreements. And in Latin America, only 2 countries, in South America, only 2 countries have free trade agreement with China. And that's Chile and Peru. And I think Panama is negotiating one. But a free trade agreement actually is not to trade copper or gold. Commodities are traded on a broader market, and the price of them depends actually on demand and on many other subjects than the free trade agreement. The free trade agreement is to trade in other value-added products and into investment, into capitals, and into people as well. So that's the interesting part. Many Latin American countries have already gone into the step of constructing the world we want to see. And it's the world in which the most important players of international relationships 300 years ago were families. For 300 years there have been states, but after states there are multinational institutions and free trade agreements or agreements of different sorts. So there are those documents that we produce that create instruments for the type of world that we're shaping. And in that sense, not only Pacific Alliance, which we are there with Colombia and Mexico and Chile, but also CPTPP and other forms of treaties construct the world. And China has been very important into maintaining free trade with the world, right? In the last few years. So in that sense, yes. Multilateralism is very important, open markets, and look at Australia. Australia, who's now candidate candidate to associate state to the Pacific Alliance, is a country that went from being a producer of commodities, minerals and wool and so on, to a producer of know-how, and transition was done from the 80s to today. So it's a very important path, and it's a way of seeing the world. And where does the money come from? From your trade and from the possibility of the other countries also growing their consumption levels. And so China has 400 million citizens of the world, they say. And it has another 800, another 900 million people who are still to come to the market, and so as well as India. So in that sense, Latin America has a bigger share of its population already in the world's market, but we still have Peru, particularly, we still have 1/5. So 20% of our population below the line of poverty, and so we have to get investment, we have to get infrastructure, but we have to get also the world in which we can contribute to.
I want to come back to the infrastructure, but I'd like to pick you up slightly on on your statement that China's been the big defender of free trade, because there is another view of China's trading practice, which is that yes, it's a lot of trade, but it's essentially a mercantilist pattern of trade, which in some ways fits with what Álvaro and Kevin have been saying about, taking in raw materials and exporting manufactured goods, low-cost manufactured goods. Now, that's not necessarily an entirely beneficial to other emerging economies, because it makes it harder to protect and develop.
It depends if you have which kind of instrument are you using to trade. If you don't have if you have a bilateral instrument, let's see what this says. If you have a free trade agreement, then let's see which other things are being traded, which are the access levels that the free trade agreement talks about. And in that sense, yes, I mean, if you are only selling commodities in the world and you don't let many of your products to come, well, or if you have a protectionist market, then you'll see what you want to protect. We had this conversation just not long ago with Colombia, and we said, we have to be where our agreement says we have to be, but the most important thing is that these are constructions that we make. So countries decide what is their position in the world in terms of how are they going to contribute to the world's economy. And when you think on how you're going to contribute to the world economy, you either decide to be a protectionist country, or you decide to be an open country. And in the case of Peru, Peru decided to become an open country because it has something, because we learned that it's very beneficial for us to buy from America, to buy from other countries. At the same time, that we can sell to those countries.
So Álvaro, Colombia's been mentioned. You know, for much of its recent history, indeed, China has maintained very strong barriers in terms of trade and investment. Is that an option that it allows its trading partners to maintain? Colombia, for example, you're in some ways at the beginning of your relationship with China. Is that a concern in Colombia?
I think so. I mean, Colombia still looks to Washington more than any other country in South America. Respice polum still guides Colombian policy. The Pacific, in many ways, has been abandoned. Going back a little bit to what the minister was saying, I think one of the problems that we see, I agree with you, that it's not all about commodities, and free trade is very important, and I think the focus has been in the region to have free trade agreements, and we have Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, and soon to come Panama, possibly in the next 5, 6, 7 months. But what I think the emphasis needs to change a little bit, because free trade agreements allow you to trade without tariffs. But what you need to incentivize is better infrastructure, because the cost of transportation in the region are 3 times higher than in many other countries, like, for example, OECD countries, that this is according to the OECD. And one of the main issues in the region is that the infrastructure is so inadequate. More than 60% of the roads are unpaved, compared to 46% in emerging economies in Asia and 17% in Europe. Latin America spends a smaller GDP on infrastructure than any other region in the world, except Sub-Saharan Africa. At present, the region only spends 2.3% of GDP on infrastructure, which is extremely low. Experts agree that to bridge that gap, you need to invest at least 6.2% of GDP annually. Now, there's some good news. The latest figures from 2015 suggest that some countries are temporarily reaching that target, notably Bolivia at 8.42, Peru at 6.89, and Colombia at 6.45. But the regional average is still very low, and in my opinion, I think this represents a threat to the region's prospects for development. So to get there, to break the dependency on commodities, you need to invest on this. And of course, that means investing in roads, railways, ports, and urban transport to make sure that the speed and the advantage of this is there. For example, to move sugar from Jujuy in Argentina, I don't know, I think we have some Argentinians here, to Buenos Aires by rail, a journey of only 1,000 miles takes 22 days. The same amount of time that it takes you to take the same sugar to Germany. Can you believe that? Cargo can be take up to 2 days from Bogotá to Santa Marta, and this is the most developed area in the region, plus another 2 days of customs. So this is something that countries need to address properly.
Tatiana.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. I think I have a somewhat different perspective. I think I wouldn't blame China for the pattern of production export we have. This has been like that throughout history. So, I mean, with other countries before, right? So that's how we got here, and there has been some very specific development, structural development in the region. But I think we cannot really, blame China for our own weaknesses. So I think China, although it makes us, I think it is pretty much like a magnifier, actually, because the scale is so big, the impact is so huge of what happens with China. It makes us see better, or it accelerates and aggravates many problems. So this is the case with the so-called, commoditization again, or deindustrialization. So it just highlights that we have to take our development in our own hands.
So is it accelerating the solutions, or just
we should accelerate
accelerating
solutions? We should actually take these opportunities. For example, if you look into Brazil, largely because of China, we don't have a current account problem these days, which is very positive when you see a lot of volatility.
Right.
So this is something that we could also take into account. This is something that changed completely from previous years and from previous crises in the 90s. But I do think, as our other panelists mentioned, yes, this is something that we have. It just reinforces that this pattern of production, and especially for large economies, is not the best one in the long run. So I think China actually gives us many times the opportunity to look into these problems. And when we face the Chinese model, and all the coordination, the synchronization of trade, investment, technological policies. It makes us think that we should have some of that. Not in the sense of, I'm not talking about interventionist policies, or I'm just talking about the role of the state in terms of providing not only the basic resources in terms of education, health, security, and, but also in terms of planning and coordination. I think this is something that it would be good for countries like Brazil to have a better coordination to deal with China. And it would also be good for Latin America that we have a better coordinated action, coordinated planning and action to deal with China, because that's the way, although we could always point that it seems to be a very complete coordination in Chinese government institutions. Of course, you'll find different views. But yes, mostly they would act as one force and coordinated. And this is something that I think we should take as a fact to improve our coordination, not as a model, because it would be very difficult to replicate such model, and I don't think that's what that's to be replicated by countries in the region, by democratic countries. But it's certainly we have to look into that, and especially now that with the infrastructure issue, as Álvaro mentioned, clearly to me, the lack of coordination. I'm talking both nationally in terms in my country, but also in the region. The lack of coordination makes us lose opportunities for having more cooperation with China for example, regional integration in electricity, roads, railways, transportation. I think it's something we have been discussing for a long time. But we are not there in the right model yet. And certainly organisms like CAF and other regional banks can be very, including the IDB, where China is already a member.
So what I'm hearing loud and clear is that infrastructure is the enormous need in the whole region, which again, luckily Belt and Road comes along. You have China at a moment in China's own economic cycle where it's looking for new markets. It's looking for it has a lot of surplus capacity that it wants to deploy around the world, including in Latin America. But what I'm also hearing are some doubts about whether the region itself is equipped to take best advantage of this. Belt and Road is a kind of vast, comprehensive sketch map, really, at this point, with a lot of projects which accrue under it, some of which were announced before Belt and Road was. So, it's still a slightly shape-shifting notion. But if you're going to have infrastructure development in the region, then regional coordination, as Tatiana has just said, would seem to be a fairly key element that would allow the region to take advantage of it best. Now, Kevin mentioned that CELAC isn't the best forum for this. Is there another forum? What can the countries in the region do at this point to sort of step up their coordination and ensure that what is developed is of comprehensive benefit?
I will say first, going back to Kevin, that first, the countries need to have a clear strategy on how to deal with China.
Pardon?
Each country has to have a clear strategy in terms of how to deal with China. In the case of Panama, we decided, after establishing relationship with China, that we set up a China cabinet, and we met twice a month, basically to discuss the strategic objective of what do we want to get from the relationship. We joined the One Belt, One Road initiative. We are negotiating the free trade, but we were very clear that we wanted China to use the logistic platform of Panama to distribute Chinese goods throughout Latin America.
And maybe not build another canal in Nicaragua.
Yeah, we could have a discussion whether that is feasible or not, but
Just a thought.
And of course, that could be also an issue. But I think that countries need to have a clear strategy how to deal with China and what they want to get out from the relationship. Secondly, you need to have a consensus within the society. And third, I think regional interaction or regional integration or cooperation, of course, will have a significant impact in improving the relationship of the region with China. But first, each country needs to go back and decide what do they want to get from the relationship. So we also want, I think, all Latin American countries want to bring into our region the massive expertise of Chinese companies, in particular in the development of infrastructure. Now they have in China actually an overcapacity in that sector, and they have tremendous experience building transmission lines, power grids, and the energy sector, roads,
trains.
And we want to bring that expertise. Also, we want to bring financing. I do have to basically said that if you are an investment rated country, probably you don't have issues on getting access to capital markets, just like Panama. We can get all the financing we want at very competitive terms and long-term terms. This is a warning. I think for the countries in Latin America, the countries should separate the financing decision of a project from the contractor of a project. So basically, don't mix up the decision, because probably you are not going to get the best solution if you mix the financing with the contractor.
But that is one of the characteristics of Chinese projects and Chinese finance.
That is one of the characteristics, yes. I'm basically telling a warning to the Latin American countries. Try not to do it, because then you're not going to get the best financing, and you're not going to get the best contractor or the best project available.
Right. Well, that's a warning. I mean, if you look at Chinese finance, the Chinese say that their finance comes without the strings and conditions that other lenders insist on. Mm-hmm. Many countries have welcomed that. It hasn't been an entirely happy story, however. I mean, if you look at China's debt to Venezuela or Ecuador, and the structures of those loans were turned out not to be very helpful, given the fluctuation in oil prices. Or in Pakistan, for example, where the chairman of the central bank said that he didn't know the conditions of Chinese lending. Chairman of the central bank didn't know. This doesn't look too good. Or in Sri Lanka with Hambantota, where Sri Lanka took on a massive debt for a port which delivered very little revenue and ended up in Chinese hands for 90 years as an extraterritorial operation.
Yeah, but let me say something there. I mean,
but these are cautionary tales. I'm just wondering if there are lessons in the region from these cautionary tales.
I would like to comment one thing. I'm not going to comment on the policy of the Chinese, because they are the ones who have to explain that. But I will comment if somebody is chairing the central bank of a country and does not know the terms of the contract he's signing, well, then
but he didn't sign it.
I would say, or somebody for him sign it, right? So I would go back to Tatiana's comment. We shall not blame our own deficiencies on China's shoulders. I mean, if the problem is with the country signing or accepting whoever goes to a bank and gets a loan and doesn't know the terms. Mm-hmm. I mean, whether it's a country or an individual.
But I guess I guess the point that I'm raising is that there is a responsibility on both sides. That a lender, it would normally be expected to behave responsibly. If a bank lends you money you can't repay, it's the bank's problem as much as your problem, and the bank's responsibility also.
Well, that's what happened. That's what provocated the tremendous crisis all over, all over Europe and the U.S. It was called junk bonds, and of course it's not only the bank's problem; it's the problem of the regulators. I mean, if you have a regulation that allows that to happen, then all of a sudden everybody has to pay for that, and the world knows that. So I think we've gone through that. And that's why I was mentioning what is the trade agreement you've signed. What are the conditions of your trade agreements? What does it mean when you sign, free trade of capitals? In the case of Peru, any of these documents has to be public and has to be printed. To be enacted, has to be in the official journal of the country and download it anytime you want from the website.
Okay, that's not the case in every country in Latin America.
I must say I don't know what's the case in other countries, but in the case of Peru, today the Peruvian president is challenging the country to do a major change. Everybody talks about second generation reforms, as a better state. Well, better state is not only the executive, of course, it's the legislative, of course, is the judiciary. And the president of Peru is challenging the judiciary because we knew that it was deficient in many ways. So challenge that, but that's homework. When you talk to another country, get your things ready.
Kevin, you've been trying to come in.
Well, first, I want to underscore what you and Tatiana have said. Don't blame Latin America's problems on the Chinese. It's been an incredible opportunity, but it just hasn't been managed as well. It's the gringos that are blaming all their problems on China, and we've got this huge trade war, which is going to drag the world economy down. On the policy conditionality, China needs to take a next step on that. China should be applauded for not having policy conditionality, right? The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund put policy conditionalities on loans in the 1980s and 1990s in Latin America, saying, we'll give you this loan for this particular project if you privatize industries far, far away from this particular project. And that put a real drag on growth in the region. It was too quick of a liberalization and a shift of economic model, and it really brought 2 decades of anemic growth to Latin America. So that we'll give China a plus for. But what China needs to get a little bit more clear on is the difference between policy conditionality and portfolio and project level due diligence, right? You have to look at what the impact of your loan portfolio is going to be on a particular country and its debt sustainability. And they obviously have gone way too far in Venezuela, way too far in Pakistan, Djibouti, and Sri Lanka. They need to get a little bit sharper on the risk assessment related to the debt sustainability of their projects. And that's different than policy conditionality, right? That's real risk assessment. Secondly, on environment and social impacts, when often in the region, the Latin American countries are offering up projects that the CAF has already said no to, that the Inter-American Development Bank has already said no to, because they didn't pass due diligence on the social and environmental impacts. The big, huge dam in Ecuador was rejected by IDB in 1992. There's almost every single project that the Chinese have financed in the in the Andean Amazon has already been rejected by somebody else on social and environmental grounds, and then therefore it's no surprise that these loans that are supposed to be 5 years, $3 billion, haven't even gotten off the ground yet because they're nests of social and environmental protests because the due diligence hasn't been done. So it's really important to get this clearer, that doing an environmental impact assessment of a project to make sure that the engineering specifications are actually going to be able to get enough water to be able to generate the electricity in a way that isn't going to cause a major blow up that causes 25,000 people to have to be moved like happened this summer in Ecuador is project level due diligence. It's not imposing environmental regulations on a country that actually has higher regulations than China does at home.
Right. Álvaro, were you trying to?
Speaking of due diligence, I think perhaps I'd like to talk briefly about the AIB in this case, which is bound to have more due diligence doesn't mean that they will. Oftentimes they relegate that to...
It's promised.
The promise, at least in paper. But this could be a source that would be very important for the region because it could provide the co-financing that is needed for many of the infrastructure gaps that we have in the region. And I'm referring to the bank is in Spanish called BAI, which is Banco Asiático de Inversión en Infraestructura, or AAIB. And for them, cross-connectivity is crucial, sustainability is crucial as a priority in order to approve projects, and they're deeply interested in the Latin American region. And the region seems to be interested in the AIB, and I said, quote unquote, seems to be interested because while the AIB has made it clear, they came to the region in March, Chile and Argentina, invited by the IDB, to express and to make sure that Latin American countries understood that they were there to offer help if they complete their membership, because they will be able to provide the co-financing that is not able to be provided entirely by the IDB or CAF perhaps alone. But they are currently no full members of the region in the AIB, and that's a problem because there are 7 countries that have been accepted to be prospective members, which is a category that the Chinese had to inflate how big their bank was initially. So they accepted these 7 countries, which are on the website, prospective members, and but we're pending for the capital transfers of their subscriptions, and that includes Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Ecuador, all in chronological order. The participation will be very modest. It will be around half of what Canada is already is in the bank, around $414 million. It's not that much. But what did this give these countries is the opportunity to have access to financing in the region and the co-financing that is very important. And Latin Americans were very proactive at getting these invitations. I think we love to be part of the club, taking the picture. I'm not so sure we are very good at completing things. And I speak that as a Latin American. Last year, they have the 2nd annual meeting in Korea, and the Peruvians didn't go. The Chinese were not very happy. This year, Peru went to the meeting, which took place in India, but Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador were missing. Of all countries, Venezuela had 7 people attending the meeting. I think none of them really knew what they were doing there, to be frank with you. But interestingly, it's an exaggeration, but I think something has to be done in terms of coordination. You talk about coordination. We talk about perhaps cooperation. I think I like the word cooperation a little bit more to understand that these projects will benefit cross-country connectivity that will eventually benefit the region. CELAC wasn't successful. I think the Chinese took that in a way of mirroring what they did in Africa with FOCAC. I think CELAC is clear now. Perhaps it's not the way forward. These sort of forums have to be taken into a more, perhaps, deeper debate and perhaps with more participation from all the different countries in the region.
It's interesting that you bring up AIIB because it's a very interesting initiative from China, first multilateral development bank and so on. It's relatively small still. Most of the lending comes from the policy banks and other Chinese banks, and those banks have not made the commitments that AIIB has made to international standards. Do you think that eventually AIIB could influence those banks in that direction, or that Chinese lending practices of the kind that Kevin was complaining about, where projects which have been rejected for very sound reasons are financed and implemented by Chinese partners, or they begin to be implemented by Chinese partners, where that doesn't happen?
I think it will happen. I think so far the AIB has been a little bit lazy, with all due respect, leaving their partners to do the due diligence.
Yeah.
They have to invest more on that. But I think they're bound to do it because they advertise that so much. They also have very important membership from European countries. And the British and the French, in a way to save face, have to push in that direction. I suspect that's one of the reasons why Latin American countries have revisited that initial invitation that came from Beijing and think, this is basically another little World Bank. Is it worth completing this membership? And I think that's perhaps one of the issues that we have to take into account. Beijing is not necessarily very happy with the AIB direction because in many ways they realize it's in a way out of their hands to a certain extent. But the AIB is fundamentally important, and there are 64 countries who are full members, and they will represent very important elements in terms of financing. And there is a country in Africa, Egypt, that already has a loan from the AIB, which demonstrates that this would be outside the region, not just for Asia. In fact, there are 3 African countries who are already full members: Ethiopia, Egypt, and Madagascar. while Latin America is still lagging behind.
I mean, it's clearly a key initiative, and there are tensions about the governance of AIIB and whether those promises, whether actually the staffing and the infrastructure exists in the AIIB to meet the standards to which it has been committed. And I think there is an open question about learning here, actually. And, you know, we tend to think China's this, you know, great super state, they know everything. But actually, in terms of risk assessment, in terms of the kind of engagement and mistakes that Shougang made when they first went abroad, in terms of the experience of operating abroad, a Chinese state-owned enterprise is not where you learn those things. You know, you have a very privileged environment in China. You know, you can basically call the party secretary and get obstacles removed. When these state-owned enterprises began to operate abroad, it was kind of a bit of a shock. And I wonder, Tatiana, you've seen this from both sides, whether in terms of project risk assessment and investment decisions, whether there's still a lot of learning to be done on the Chinese side.
Oh, absolutely.
Certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so one thing is the Chinese side and the issues that also Kevin was mentioning. But we have to understand that this is very new, right? We are talking about the going out policy starting in 2000. And coming from, the Chinese coming from the opening up, the reform and opening up has 40 years. So, and see the tremendous changes that have happened in these 40 years in a totally different regime. I think this also gives us the opportunity of thinking about the big picture and what about those financial institutions mean, these new financial institutions. It was unthinkable. I mean, even in the 90s, to think about that. I think, there were talks about already Asian Monetary Bank at that time, but nothing like we have now. So this has happened really fast. And in a way, it also shows us that things haven't really gone where most of, at least the Western world thought in the early 90s, right? And then after China's accession to the WTO. So we thought there would be some convergence. There is some convergence. There is a lot of convergence in terms of, I think, opening up and tariffs. You can always see like the glass half empty or half, but of course there's a tremendous transformation and opening in China. There remains significant barriers to, especially to investment, also a very opaque environment, a different environment to work with, but it has really opened up. Now, for what we see now is this sort of a new system. These seeds that are actually growing up from this sort of transition, or new world order, something that we're living as we speak. So of course it's very difficult for us to really, sure. but and that said, when you talk, so this is from this more long-term view, political view. Now from the corporate and side, we can, on the corporate side, we can see that by the different tales we have from investors, for example, in my country, you see that, there has been a lot of investment, not good due diligence, and sometimes it takes like the central government to say, no, now stop. Right? This is like what happened since 2013, 14, 15, a lot of legislation in China for facilitation of investment abroad. And then end of 16, 17, there were excesses. So now let's have a look at that, and that's what happened. So messages all through the country that they should, and this is sort of a way, also the Chinese way of dealing with this learning. That is learning from society for this new world. And we see, for example, in Brazil, cases where we know that there have been, even with major corporations, listed corporations, that you have bad investments, but you have very good investments too. And I also think that the Chinese are very happy. Thank you for the loans that they are giving to most of Latin America, actually, if you compare also to other regions and other cases. So there may be extreme cases like in our region, like in Venezuela, but it's a whole sort of different conditions. But mostly, I would say it's a place where even it could be seen as, I've heard from Chinese officials in state-owned banks, also in policy banks, like this is an interesting also springboard for them to learn Western rules, but yet being in an environment of developing countries, where you still also see the world in a similar way, right? We cannot forget that China's second world power, but still developing country.
Yes, and I would like to add something of my own experience. Before China was accepted to the World Trade Organization, there was a visit of the chairman of the Communist Party and the Secretary of Commerce to different countries of Latin America to ask for the vote of the countries in favor of China becoming member. I don't know if you remember that event, but then when he was traveling in Peru, he explained to us, he said to us, the Americans, he said, particularly Madeleine Albright with name, he said, particularly her, are very insistent in property rights, intellectual property. And I explained it, he said, I explained it to her, that when I was a kid, we didn't own our pants. So property is a concept. It's a concept in different societies, and property is a concept that today in the world, individual property is understood as part of property of European tradition, in which you have 300 years, 400 years of individual property, if not more. And when I was a kid, he said, we didn't own our pants. So this was just to illustrate where China was coming from in his own generation, right? So we asked him, I said, sir, okay, understood that, but we also know that China is a millennial culture. And during the times of Admiral Wu, Chinese were issuing letters of credit. If a letter of credit is not intellectual property, what is it? And so he said, oh no, I hate historians. This is China. I mean, we all have to learn from both sides. We have to understand how they think. And we also, I mean, Peru, we also are a millennial culture. So we have to understand how the world thinks, but not in terms of, not in short time terms. We have to understand what is our contribution in long term, as well as being practical today. You know? I mean, for Peru, I can understand the complexity embedded into every investment, right? The mining investment or energy investment and where you're investing and so. But besides that, I mean, the big picture is there is a big market over there. In Peru, we have about 4 million workers in agriculture. And if those 4 million only feed 30 million Peruvians, that means that every farmer has only 9 tummies to fill. That means poverty. If we expand that market, if we go to the average of the world, which is every farmer feeds about 170 people, which is Argentina or a little bit more in the US, then all of a sudden you have a booming agricultural sector. And with that, we think, you know, let's sell avocados in the US. And I mean, it's a very basic concept, but that's how we think about our relationship with that big market that's China.
Right. Dulcidio, you mentioned earlier the dangers of mixing finance and projects, that essentially they had to be separate. Back in April, all the European Union ambassadors but one, the exception being Hungary, signed a report which had various concerns about Belt and Road and how it was operating. There were lots of concerns which were specific to the European Union. But one of the things that was a worry to them was the fact that 89% of the Belt and Road projects had gone to Chinese companies. So, as a kind of win-win proposition, this is a little skewed. And that was largely because the finance, was tied to Chinese companies. So how can Latin America avoid this?
Well, first, I think you have to separate the countries in Latin America, the ones with access to capital markets and the ones without. For the ones without, it's going to be a very difficult decision, or very difficult to separate the financing from the project itself. And at the end, the country will have to decide whether the project is needed so much that they are willing to bundle the financing with the contractor. For countries with access to capital markets, then the decision is very clear. You need to separate the decision. I mean, the financing, you can have access to financing at long-term financing at good rates, and then you choose the project and the contractor based on the best offer from the market. So in the case of Panama, it's an easy decision to make. We have access to capital markets. For other countries, it's difficult. It's a difficult one. So there's no clear answer, and I think every country has to choose the path to follow.
So Dulcidio's laid out this ideal scenario. So what are the chances here, Kevin?
Well, going back to my original remarks, this is where strategy comes in. It's actually not true that in every case the Chinese are requiring their locals. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in a lot of the investments in Petrobras, there's hardly any Chinese involved, whereas in a lot of the oil concessions in Ecuador there are, and a lot of that's because in Brazil there's all sorts of engineers who know a lot about oil and so forth, and in Ecuador there aren't, and Brazil can sometimes bargain better. And what I'm saying for the region, what a lot of folks are saying about the region, is that collectively they have an incredible strategic amount of bargaining power because they have location-specific assets that China needs. Can't get the copper hardly anywhere else besides Peru and Chile. Iron ore, Peru, Brazil, the soybeans, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, and so forth. If there's a regional strategy, then you have more bargaining power as a collective group. And so far that really hasn't been maximized. I don't want to give the implication that I said to get rid of SELAC. They're really important. That's sort of the arms of all the state departments, but it needs more of a partnership. During the Free Trade Area of the Americas negotiations, it was the IDB, the CEPAL, and the OAS. Right? That's not the right kind of tripartite partnership for China-Latin America relationships because it has the United States involved. But if something like CEPAL with the CAF and SELAC could be more of a sharing of partnerships where different parts of those bodies have different kinds of expertise, with the CAF with the financing, the SELAC with the foreign relations, and CEPAL with more of the longer run development kind of aspects. And convening power and trust that's opened up to the business community and civil society organizations. That's going to give you a lot of forum and a lot of bargaining power. And I would wager, like Tatiana said, if there was an actual regional infrastructure plan or a regional grid proposal or a package set of distributed energy for the region, that the region said finance this part, and this part, the Chinese are more than willing to negotiate because their strategy in terms of financing is not just returns on investment in particular projects, right? Because they're trying to get their companies to learn how to be global. They're trying to diversify their foreign exchange holdings, and so they're willing to take more risks and be more long-term. And I just don't see many countries in the region as a whole taking full advantage of it. And you really can, because you can't get the copper anywhere else.
Tatiana, are people really kind of parlaying their strengths or failing to?
Just a quick remark. We had a meeting in Mexico not long ago, and that's the Pacific Alliance meeting. But there was something very interesting on that Pacific Alliance meeting. Mercosur was present. And so Mercosur, with 2 presidents and 2 ministers, was present. We had a first talk between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur in terms of infrastructure needed and some of the global views. So maybe that's the space, but please.
Encouraging steps.
In terms of this, I agree completely with Dulcidio about it's something we have been discussing a lot in Brazil, including in the Brazilian Center for International Relations, where I coordinate a group, it has been many years since we feel this need for really to have a clearer strategy on China. And I'm very happy to learn that also you have this cabinet group. It's very interesting. But I think it's very difficult for long-term projects, large infrastructure projects, for you to dissociate completely the contractor with the financing. I mean, usually I would see in all the, if you have bids and all the consortiums that would come, usually they would come with some association with finance, and that's the way it has always happened to different Exim banks around the world, and also credit insurance agencies. But we could try to mitigate certain risks, and for example having different associations with local companies, or not only a Chinese project, but a cooperation, like the regional cooperation project, for example. I think.
And excuse me, but doesn't competitive bidding, doesn't open, transparent, and competitive bidding address some of
Yeah, I'm getting to this part.
Sorry.
So that's why the Chinese haven't really been building a lot of infrastructure, for example, in Brazil. It just hasn't happened. They have been buying a lot of companies, mostly through merger and acquisitions. Mostly through acquisitions. So today they have very sizable investments in the Brazilian electric sector. Mostly, so about over 80% of Chinese, about the 55 billion more or less of Chinese investments in Brazil would be in the energy sector, including electric sector, also oil and gas, some mining. But it's not again a Chinese fault, because we have to have very clear rules mitigating long-term risks. This is something that we have been struggling with for many years. We have improved somewhat in some areas in the last few years, but still there are lots of issues, even regulatory issues. For example, in railways, in roads. We have some improvements, mostly in ports, and where you have more open environment, you would see the Chinese coming. For example, in ports, they have made some important investments. In electric sector, although we even had some regulatory issues in this sector, but they have been very strong. Why? Because Chinese companies see a real advantage to them. You wouldn't have such a vast country where they could apply their technology, some of the technology as ultra high voltage as Brazil. So this is an interesting case, and the electric companies there are for now very strong. But so we have to dissociate between investments also and financing. So, for example, in the case of actually in the oil sector, at least with the state-owned company, Petrobras, there really only recently there have been some joint investments in the biddings, but actually most, so this in the last 5 years, But mostly we're talking about financing, not really, investments. But and going to the Belt and Road, we see also that over 60 to 70% of actually resources, we are also talking about financing mostly, not investment. So this is something that we have to work on. I think a good, maybe an interesting way out is for us to work in cooperation, as Álvaro mentioned, having more actors on board. And also, one last comment about this, the financing, different financing mechanisms and funds that the Chinese have created, especially for Latin America. For example, the Industrial Cooperation Fund, the CLI Fund, the Latin America Cooperation Fund, the CLAC Fund. They have actually hardly disbursed, any loans.
Why?
My take is that they're in a learning process. So they are actually funds to to cooperate and invest in the region, to increase economic cooperation. But they were also funds from the Chinese point of view, the regulators and the finance, they were like investments for Chinese reserves. So they want high returns on that. But it's very difficult to have, in the high returns short term if you want to invest in infrastructure. So you need to have a longer, so I think this will need to be adjusted. And also the bureaucracies has been formed. They were not, most of the bureaucracy in this, they were not exposed to foreign countries or to projects. Mm-hmm. So it's something that I think we should build together.
That's that learning,
yes,
that we were talking about. I want to move on to another issue. I was very struck 5 years ago, the Atlantic Council published a report on, which is entitled something like US-China Cooperation, the Key to the Global Future, which makes you think what a long time 5 years can be. We have seen a bit of a breakdown in that cooperation, threatened trade wars. Latin America is a region traditionally, or at least in relatively recent history, very much in the US camp. We're living through this extraordinary US presidency in which old alliances are apparently not as valued as they were, in which is having extraordinary destabilizing effects around the world. But this region, Latin America, is in the eye of the storm, if you like, that you have, if there is really to be a confrontation between the US and China, what difficulties does that create for Latin America? We've seen this extraordinary episode with Salvador switching its diplomatic recognition to the PRC from Taiwan, and a slightly bizarre reaction, frankly, from the United States to that. Dulcidio, you switched relatively recently from Taiwan to the PRC. I presumably felt well rewarded for that. But if this is a pattern now in global politics, what are the impacts on Latin America, given your relationship with China, the investment from China, the traditional relationship with the United States, the continuing importance of the United States in the region? How is that going to play out, do we think?
First, I think this is a reality. I mean, the U.S. has been basically withdrawing, I will say, for the last 10 years from the region. Basically, they focus their, in particular with Central America, they focus their relationship on basically security in terms of immigration and the fight on drugs. Okay. But the rest of the issues are not at the forefront of the bilateral dialogue between the U.S. and Central America. And with this administration, these issues have been basically exacerbated. So there's a vacuum. And China basically is filling that vacuum left by the U.S. They have the means, they have overcapacity, they have the savings, and they are looking for Latin America to be a strategic place to invest, basically to get some of the raw materials and the ability to invest. The Latin American countries now face a very difficult path ahead. In terms of course, you need to maintain a healthy relationship with the U.S., but at the same time, you want to develop a stronger ties with China. Looks like here in the U.S., the China issues, in particular with Latin America, is becoming a big concern for U.S. policy. So what I see moving forward is a very rough, very difficult path for Latin American countries when they try to improve or strengthen their relationships with China. And we're going to get probably a harsh response from Washington on this subject. Look, the best example is what's happening with El Salvador. So we'll see. I mean, it's going to be a very difficult, stormy.
I see it as interesting times. They're all, but also opportunities.
Minister, when Rex Tillerson warns you about the dangers of snuggling up to China, do you pay any attention?
Oh, I would say okay. I mean, what does it mean snuggling up? Peru.
I don't think that was his
Peru.
phrase.
Yeah, Peru has a free trade agreement with China, with Japan, with Korea, and we're negotiating one with Vietnam, with Brunei, with Dar es Salaam.
So that's a no. You say you pay no attention to it.
No, we actually have a very interesting trade balance with the U.S. It is in favor of the U.S. by about 1.4 billion every year.
Yeah.
So and that's what it is. We buy more than what we sell. Thank you very much. Right. I mean, our consumers benefit from that. So we're not going to go and say we need to balance the trade and you need to buy more. No, we think that's part of the business. It's completely the opposite with China. We actually, they buy us more than what we sell. We also are happy with that. Don't think that we want to balance that too. So I think it's case by case, it's free trade agreements, it's more the instruments you build. And the reason why I was mentioning, the free trade agreement with Japan and Korea and so is because for Peru, Asia has been continuously a trading partner. We have a China embassy in Peru since the 70s. So 1970s is when Peru officially opened its trade, when not even the States was open. I remember the ping pong diplomacy?
Yeah, 71.
Yeah, we already had an embassy then.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Álvaro, you were...
I think the geopolitical element has been there for some time. I mean, going back to Panama, the U.S. had concerns when 1997 came and Hutchinson Whampoa took over the ports. So this is a concern that has been going on for some time. They were very silent on the Panamanian switching to the Popular Republic of China from Taiwan. They were silent on the Dominican Republic, and now I think this is a political strategy by Trump. I don't think he really knows what he's doing in terms of making a statement. Actually, Obama was more strategic about fencing China off with his own initiative in the region, in India, and then with the TPP as well, which is one of the first things that Trump got rid of when he came to office. So I think the geopolitical element is there. Obviously, China has the advantage of not having any dirty laundry in the region whatsoever so far. But I think it's an important issue to consider. And of course, the U.S. has this long history with the region, and of course, will be used for political reasons as much as we want. But I think it's a consideration that has to be taken into account, definitely.
Well, when then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said much the same thing in Africa, African countries said, fine, but what are you bringing to the party? to the United States. And do you think there's any prospect that China's expansion in what was the U.S. backyard will stimulate the U.S. to take more interest again in the region, or is this just a withdrawal from global engagement that we're seeing?
One would hope. I mean, if you talk to people in the State Department, the Western Hemisphere affairs, they probably want to do that, but they always felt that they have been neglected in every single administration. I mean, this is not, the neglect to the region didn't come with Trump, by the way. Yeah. This has been happening for decades. Mm-hmm. So we cannot just simply blame Trump for the neglect to the region, which has happened in the past as well. Interestingly, Trump has had an interesting impact in the region, which is a unifying effect. Somehow we feel more alike Latinos because the fact that Trump is going after the Hispanic Americans in many ways. So, but I think the problem has been there for a long time.
Kevin, you've written about this triangle many times.
The worst case is an absolute disaster. There's some interest in the United States that would love to see a new Cold War with China, and I hope they're on the losing side of these debates. The two countries are 40% of the world economy, more than 60% of world trade, and so if there is a massive trade war or some security concern, we're all in trouble economically, especially the United States. The GAO estimates that we're going to have $1 trillion in debt, and we borrow close to, we're buying hundreds of millions of dollars from the Chinese every single day. But on the positive end, there's been a couple positive things that could play in. I'd wager that if it wasn't for all this Chinese finance, you would have never have seen a $5 billion capital increase at the World Bank and the IFC last year. There's also a bill moving through Congress called the BUILD Act that would consolidate a number of the credit granting agencies in the United States and create our own International Development Finance Corporation, which would be our own sort of international development finance institution. And so if the United States can show that we can provide better financing that is for more diverse, socially inclusive and environmentally protecting growth-enhancing finance, then there'll be competition could be a good thing. We love to preach. Americans love to preach competition until it's competition with us.
With or without political attachment to the finance.
We shall see.
Dulcidio.
Now, one good thing that is happening because of China investing in the region is that recently there was an initiative by the U.S. Treasury, and I believe they reached an agreement with Mexico, and then they reached an agreement with Panama in terms of for the development of the energy sector, both in Mexico and in Panama. So I think the U.S., some institutions are reacting to the fact that the Chinese are so engaged in Latin America that they are reacting, and besides looking at other sectors that are of interest for Latin America, besides security and immigration.
Great. We have a few minutes, and I know there's a lot of expertise in the House. I can't see you very well, but I can see a hand there. We have two microphones either side, so you're encouraged to go to the... Yeah, it's just there, I think. I think I can see that. If you could bring the house lights up, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Yes, there we go.
So please tell us who you are, and if your question's aimed at a particular panelist, tell us that too.
My name is Luis Parada. I am from El Salvador, but I'm an attorney here. I've lived here for 21 years. Question is about El Salvador, actually, since you mentioned that. And the surprise in El Salvador was not just the opening of relations with China, and of course, with that has to come along the severing of relations with Taiwan, but the surprise. I mean, there was no transparency at all. There was no discussion or anything. It was just an overnight surprise, immediately followed by the Prime Minister of Taiwan saying, yes, we were asked for all this investment and actually a political contribution to the ruling party, and we said no. So the implication is that China said yes. And the question I have is, and it has been said by the U.S. ambassador in El Salvador that China's practice is to actually not think twice about paying a bribe if it's asked. My question is, in the experience that you have had, the countries that have relations with China and the experts from other institutions, is it true that China would have a policy of actually bribing countries to establish relations with them?
Well, I can answer from Panama, and let me be very clear. China is the second largest user of the Panama Canal. 10% of the Panamanian population is from Chinese origin, and is the second largest supplier. So for Panama, it's strategic to have a relationship with China, even though we share probably more common values with Taiwan, and we have a very long relationship with Taiwan. We changed because it was in the interest of Panama to do so.
But again, who is the corrupt? The one asking for the bribe or the one paying the bribe? Both of them, certainly, but we cannot blame the actions of a company or a country to that country if the practice is accepted in the other country. So I cannot say Brazil is a corrupt country because Odebrecht was a corrupt company. It is that company, it is that group, and luckily, I was talking that with Tatiana, luckily there is a judiciary that has put those people in jail. But that's it's our own work. You know, if you're saying that the country has accepted a bribe to change its policy, we'll look at the political establishment, because that should not be there. I mean, the
question was the likelihood of this having happened. Does anyone? Yes.
I think that's an interesting question. I think the media will probably emphasize that, the Taiwanese perhaps. Talking to people in Central America that shifted from Taiwan to China have argued that one of the sources of a lot of corruption was actually Taiwan, because there was a lot of unaccounted cash floating around to the ministries and to the people in the government. And that has been the evidence that at least the Costa Ricans have given me. I think there is a financial incentive, obviously, for El Salvador to switch to China because they will get more money for their cooperation. You want to call that bribing? I mean, it's a national interest for El Salvador. I think very respected in that sense, because Taiwan doesn't have the funding to offer that China actually has.
Okay. The young man there was, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Gallagher, my question's for you. So you mentioned
Could you tell us who you are, please?
Sebastian Mag from FTI Consulting.
Thank you.
You mentioned in your initial remarks that had China not stepped in after the 2008 financial crisis, we'd probably be seeing much more of Argentinas and Venezuelas in Latin America. But I don't think I need to remind you that Argentina and Venezuela borrowed the heaviest from China next to Brazil in the region. And one could argue, I want your opinion on this, one could argue that financing that Venezuela and Argentina received from China could have provided a cushion for their structurally high fiscal deficits. And we're seeing the consequences of that being dragged to today. So was it that China really stepped in to save the day, or did they just prolong the crisis a little bit and we're just about to see that happening now? There's a small spin-off question I'd like to ask Tatiana. Brazil also borrowed heavily from China, but the borrowing was slightly different in that it was decentralized. Petrobras borrowed directly from China instead of it going to the central government in Brasilia. Do you think this is a better method of borrowing from China, to just have it to state-owned companies that have their own corporate governance and that can manage the money themselves, rather than to the central governments? Thanks both.
Great question. Well, the whole region went from no trade with China to making it their second largest trading partner for the whole region, and number one for South America, and that some countries helped their fiscal space with that, and some of them did squandered it, which is my point. Venezuela is an absolute case in point. You know, they didn't just squander their China opportunities. Theirs is more of a political crisis that the economy was a tool of it. well, I'll let experts go deeper into that. So clearly the Chinese loans helped Venezuela, continue to help Venezuela kick the can down the road. Argentina is a little bit more complicated. I'll blame 50% of it on the past, 25% on the century bonds, and 25% on the Fed and the Trump tantrum and what's happening in markets right now with contagion. So that one's a little bit more complicated. I guess a good counterfactual, sort of Ecuador and China, Ecuador and Venezuela and Argentina and Chile too, right? So you got Chile, which totally did well with the China boom, selling all that copper to them. They've got a stabilization fund that helped them have the largest stimulus package in the region. They spent a lot, invested in education, invested in poverty alleviation, and they've been able to grow significantly. Same thing with Ecuador. They're fairly interesting. Ecuador's, if you go look for all, we have a database with the dialogue of all these projects that are funded by the Chinese, and the Associated Press did a story. They went looking for Ecuador with all due respect, in Venezuela with all due respect to the Venezuelans. They couldn't find half of them. Okay, I have issues with some of the projects that the Ecuadorians have financed, but they're all there. There are hydroelectric power plants all over the place. There's wind power plants, there's infrastructure and so forth. They're actually one of the only countries in the region since 2003 that averaged pretty close to 25% of GDP investment in the region. And so they used it. They're not in that place. And so I'll agree. Venezuela is the Pakistan of the region for this. And China, like I said earlier, has to get better on its due diligence with respect to debt sustainability. They get in the same problem that the U.S. banks did. Venezuela started going and saying, "Look, you're not going to get any of your money back if you give us another $10 billion." And when China had $4 trillion in reserves, that was not a problem. But this is a unique time for China right now because they're becoming more risk averse than they ever have. They prematurely opened up their capital account and lost over $1 trillion over the last 18 months. They're worried about their shadow banking system and the financial instability at home, and they're worried that they might have to do what they did in 1997 and sort of mop it up with their own reserves. And so the IMF says that even though they have still trillions of dollars worth of reserves, every Latin American country would die for that. The optimal rate is they're actually below it in what it would take to pay for imports and pay for mopping up the region. And so they can't gamble with this money in Pakistan, Venezuela, all over the place anymore. And they need to get a lot more sharp about risk assessment.
Tatiana, a quick response.
Yes, I think the way that the Chinese financing has flowed to Brazil, has to do with specifics also of the country and the situation. So we actually have, in the last years, we have been a net creditor country, so we really don't have an external debt problem. So it's just normal that companies would borrow according to their situation. And when the Petrobras needed that back in 2009, in a very volatile situation, the Chinese were there, and they showed up. And it was actually this loan was already paid back recently. So I think it was good business for both sides.
I'm going to ask you to be brief, sir, because we're running out of time.
I'll be very brief.
Thank you.
Timothy Tell, former State Department officer, 30 years, mostly in Latin America in the last century. Is there any linkage between the Chinese investment trade in our hemisphere and the question of diplomatic relations? The Chinese have a fit about Taiwan, as everybody knows. I was just down at the inauguration of the new president of Paraguay, Mario Abdo Benitez. And the Chinese president was there, or the Taiwanese president was there, a very attractive lady. And according to the international press, the Chinese went bananas over that, and also about the fact that she came through the United States, coming and going, and came to Washington, went up on Capitol Hill, went to California, went to the Reagan Museum, saw congressmen, did all that stuff. Is there any relationship, or is it two different things.
Certainly. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? When China opened relationships with Peru, Taiwan is believed in their own terms that it's part of China. So they don't accept another embassy. No country will accept the same name of his own country with another embassy. No, not even the Germans. You know, East Germany was called Deutsche Demokratische Republik, and the other one was the Bundesrepublik. So nobody could miss them, and that's what happens. I mean, it truly is. But looking beyond this difference between China's, I think the role that China is playing in Latin America is a long-term role. And because they think in long term, they have plans for 2050 with Latin America. So most countries are looking at the next 10 years. China is looking at the next half century, at least. So that's a very important issue to have in mind.
Okay. I tend to agree with the Minister.
These are going to have to be your closing remarks.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the Minister. China is the largest country in terms of population, the second largest economy, a huge trading partner with Latin America, has significant reserve, just strategic for the region to have a relationship with China. And it's a reality. So more than Taiwan, even though probably we share more values with Taiwan than with China. But the reality is that in the interest of Latin America, to have good relationship with China, just as is in the interest of Latin America to have good relationship with the U.S.
Tatiana.
Quick comment on the Taiwan question, actually. To my recollection, because we are now talking about the recent situation of El Salvador, but what happened is during many years, actually, China was sort of trying not to let many countries, move to the Chinese side to avoid, difficult questions both with Taiwan, because when the relations are warmer on that side, then they would avoid actually this. Or so I think it's not true that China goes around enticing those countries. Probably many would choose to do that. If not talking specifically of any case, I'm just mentioning that this was so. So since it's my last comments, it's really a pleasure to be here today, and we are very hopeful that that dialogues like that will lead us to more coordination, will lead us to especially having more consistent national strategies to deal with China, and also to upgrade our regional strategy to deal with China, especially with a view to more infrastructure integration.
Kevin, is that what you would hope for the next, if we were to look at the next 10 years?
Sure, I would say that China is a tremendous, and Asia in general is a tremendous opportunity for the region, but every opportunity brings its own challenges. And the nut to crack is to maximize the benefits and mitigate the risks of those challenges, and conversations like this and bringing people together like the way you folks do, and are part of that process.
Having a regional strategy is very challenging, very difficult. In foreign policy terms, it's almost impossible, but having cooperation, it is possible. And I think the majority of the countries in Latin America are realizing that it is for their benefit to have a good relationship with China. China wants to have a healthy relationship, and they also want countries that have a coherent idea of what they want in the future. And I think that should be one of the pushing elements on Latin America getting together to have a clear strategy with China, but still very difficult. Possible in academia, but in reality a little bit more difficult. Forums like CAF, the IDB, can push forward this agenda because they have the capacity to think long term, which countries, politically speaking, can't. So I think it is very important to emphasize to have a long-term strategy, perhaps learning from other initiatives like the Pacific Alliance that brings the private sector, which is forced to think about the long term more than the actual governments. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. This has been a very rich discussion. it would be a shame to try and summarize it in 30 seconds, but I think one of the key lessons that I've drawn from it is that the arrival of this big player is at least highlighting the need for a solution to some of Latin America's long-term problems. You know, Simón Bolívar said, you know, creating unity in Latin America is like plowing the sea. We've come quite a long way from there, but we still seem to be talking about a need for firmer institutions, for more coordination, for more cooperation, and for more strategic planning. And if the China challenge, or the challenge of China's arrival, helps to stimulate that, then that seems to me a very promising, positive note to end on in the future. So thank you so much, all of you. It's been terrific to be in conversation with you. Thank you for being here, and please thank our panelists.
Thank you, Isabel, and members of the panel for that fascinating discussion. And thanks to everyone for joining us for the first day of the 22nd Annual CAF Conference. We trust you enjoyed today's sessions, and we hope to see you back here tomorrow for a full day of a stimulating exchange. We have a great agenda on tap with another impressive lineup of distinguished speakers. Registration begins tomorrow morning at 8:15 with breakfast, and the first